So tonight's webinar is all about a student's right tuition reimbursement for private school. And we want to touch on a couple things that I think will help parents and guardians who aren't so sure if their child is receiving the education that they are truly entitled to within the public school system. And that's going to be the focus of tonight. Before we begin, got to throw out that legal disclaimer. We want to offer information about this process and procedure tonight, but of course, this is not legal advice. The advice that we're going to give you, or excuse me, the information that we're going to give you is about legal proceedings, and therefore I'd recommend anyone before starting the tuition reimbursement process is to seek out an attorney, especially in your state, as it's different from state to state, asking information about that before starting the tuition reimbursement process, because it is technically a legal proceeding. Well, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Tom Davis. I work for a small boutique law firm named Raphael and Associates. We're located in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, a couple minutes outside Philadelphia, essentially off of the campus of Villanova University. So surrounded by college kids all day while I try to do work with the windows open. So we tend to get a lot done, especially on Friday afternoons. We are focused in special education law at the firm that I work at. And a lot of the cases that we get are parents reaching out to us asking about, Tom, our child is a special needs child, been identified with a disability, either under the IDEA or Section 504, and the public school isn't working out. And my child isn't making progress. We want to go into the private school and we want the district to help. Can we do it? And in short, the answer is yes. It's not an easy answer, but the answer is yes, that the private school under the law, public schools under the law can be responsible for reimbursement of private school tuition. And that's what we're going to touch on tonight. So I think we'd just like to do 5 major topics that can hopefully help everyone out who's here tonight with us. First, a brief overview of the laws that apply here and the laws that I essentially practice under as a special education parent side attorney. We're also going to talk about the word that gets thrown around a lot and is FAPE, which stands for a free and appropriate public education. Just what is that? How does it apply to your children and in their education? Then we're really going to dive into it. There's essentially 3 areas of private school placement that we'll dive into. And number 3 is the unilateral placement, which is most common and the one that I most common see in my practice. We also have the potential for residential placements, which aren't as common, but are nonetheless as important. Very important for certain students, depending on their needs, whether it be emotional, therapeutic, behavioral. And definitely we need to touch on it. And then number 5 is somewhat, as we call almost like a backdoor approach to placement and tuition reimbursement. And that's a prospective placement, which is what we will touch on. If you have any questions, we'll do a Q&A session at the end. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can and hope to give everyone some guidance tonight. So if we look at the laws that we practice under, there are essentially 2. We have first the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, known as the IDEA, and then we have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. We never want to assume, but there's a chance that a majority of the people here, your child may have an IEP, an Individualized Education Program. An IEP is what is developed under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. We also have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. This is where we would see a 504 service plan, potentially for a medical diagnosis, but not so much a diagnosis or an identification of a specific learning disability or an identified disability that's affecting one's ability to access the curriculum in the public school. FAPE, as I mentioned, is a free and appropriate public education. Every child in the United States of America is entitled to this, especially and definitely even if they are not identified with a disability. Every child is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. So what is a FAPE? If you have a child with an IEP, that IEP must be reasonably calculated for that child to make appropriate progress in light of their circumstances. And I kind of broke it up into three. For IEP to be reasonably calculated, it has to be based on data, observations, and overall accepted evaluations of that child. This might include progress monitoring of IEP goals. This could be the triennial, or for some students, a biannual reevaluation every 2 or 3 years, depending on that child's identification. Either way, the IEP, falls in line with what is found in that reevaluation report. And in my mind, as a parent attorney, I find that reevaluation report to be really the key driving factor when looking at an IEP. That child also must make appropriate progress for that IEP to offer him or her a FAPE. And what is very important to look at is that progress is viewed to be appropriate in light of that child's circumstances. What is that child's cognitive ability, behavioral ability, emotional ability? Every child is different, therefore every child is going to progress differently. When it comes down to it, it's going to be a view of either a hearing officer or an administrative law judge to determine what that progress is. Take two different academic profiles as to what appropriate progress might be. We look at some of our clients who come in who are intellectually disabled. What progress should that be in comparison to our children who come in who are gifted, but also have an identification under the IDEA, maybe it's ADHD. The progress of what is going to be appropriate is going to be viewed differently based on those two academic profiles. The major case from the Supreme Court that came out several years ago that kind of broke this down for all of us is Andrew F. And a quick Google will find many law articles along with the case law with that. But what if your child has a 504 service plan? Yes, they are entitled to a FAPE as if they had an IEP. However, the determination of that is going to be a little different. What we just went over on the IDEA, or if your child has an IEP, that's really focused on the child's progress based on their abilities. When we look at FAPE under a 504, we don't look at the unique needs of the child. We say, are disabled students receiving educational services as effective as non-disabled peers? When it comes down to it in courts, many courts rule, not all, but many courts will rule in the majority of cases that if the IDEA FAPE has been denied, a 504 right to a free and appropriate public education has been denied as well. Cases that don't align would be significant outliers in that. So let's talk about what everyone's here tonight to discuss, and that is placement. Many of our children start out in public schools. I have a child there now. She's a kindergartner doing her half-day kindergarten. She says it's the hardest thing in the world. So she's got a lot to learn, especially even moving up to first grade here. She seems to fall in line. She fits the mold. She seems to do well so far in these early weeks. But what about those children who don't fit that mold of public school? An IEP is implemented. And even with the IEP accommodations and modifications to the program, that child still isn't making that necessary or appropriate progress in light of their circumstances. A parent can now, under the IDEA and 504, determine that placement is no longer appropriate and seek tuition reimbursement from a school district for a private school placement. And this is what's called a unilateral placement, or one of the terms for it is place and chase, where you place the child and then chase back the district for the reimbursement is what a common term is. So other than making appropriate progress in light of their circumstances, why remove your child from the public school? Well, maybe the school district has proposed a placement that parents find is too restrictive or too inappropriate or too restrictive or inappropriate for that child. In the state of Pennsylvania, where I practice, we have what seem to be two arguments towards appropriate private schools. We have state-run private schools known as APSs, approved private school. They're good schools. However, parents look at them in comparison to true private schools that are privately run, not run by the state or regulated by the state, yet offer special education services. This is where parents in the districts can butt heads and come to different conclusions as to what is appropriate for that child. Well, oftentimes we see intermediate units here in Pennsylvania that offer very good programs for certain children that parents just don't feel align with theirs as a private school, a true private school might. And this compels parents to look into that unilateral placement. What is the district's obligation? If the district has made FAPE available to the child, it is not obligated to fund the private placement. Simple as that. So when you look into the unilateral placement procedure, there's a risk to it. And of course, we tell our clients this when they engage with us, even prior to engaging with us, but you are at risk because the burden is going to be on the parents. They're going to need to show that they should be awarded tuition reimbursement through a hearing officer or an administrative judge decision. So let's talk real world. What does this mean? You have to front the money. When it comes down to tuition reimbursement, some schools understand the procedure and they may welcome that child into their private school on a contingent basis as if they would win the due process hearing for that tuition. It happens. But more often than not, the parents will have to front the tuition. Some of these tuitions, especially if we get into residential treatments, residential treatment facilities, can be very hefty. It can be very burdensome on the parents. So there is risk involved. There's always risk involved in any legal matter, but it's really important to understand the risk moving into a unilateral placement proceeding. So now we talked about the risk. Well, okay, do people succeed? Yes, people succeed all the time. They bring these cases before, in Pennsylvania, we have hearing officers. In some states of New Jersey, where I don't practice, I believe they have administrative law judges that will hear testimony, evidence will be presented, and the burden, again, is going to be on the parents to prove by preponderance of the evidence 3 steps. There's actually 4. It's not officially included, but I really think the 4th step that I add is one of the most important. So how do you succeed at a hearing? So step 1 is you must give written notice to the district. What this is really an equities issue of giving the district fair notice that you not only are going to be removing your child from the district, but you're also intending to seek tuition for a private school, which could be north of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on where that placement may be. You must give that notice in writing to the district or to the charter school, whichever your son, daughter, child attends, and that notice must be in writing. That writing must include that you intend to place your child at the private school, and that you intend to seek reimbursement from the district or charter for that placement. And this is really important for what we'll touch on in a few slides here is going to be the equities prong involving parent involvement and really just the overall fairness and ability for the parent to work with the district during this time. When you give written notice, the district has 10 days under the law to hold an IEP meeting if this is done under the IDEA. Under the 504, there is no formal procedure for unilateral placement. However, it still can be an available remedy, which we will touch on later. But the true unilateral placement procedure is lined out under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act. When you give that notice, the district then has 10 days. They may take that 10 days to redevelop, redesign an IEP. They may even choose to place your child at a private school. It may not be the one that you've chosen or hope to choose for your child. But either way, that's their one last chance to make an offer of FAPE, a free and appropriate public education for your child. This last offer is really what the court, whether it be a hearing officer or an administrative law judge, is what they're going to look at and what they're going to consider as to the appropriateness. And that we'll talk about that in our next slide. The Burlington Carter three-prong analysis is how we approach unilateral placement cases. And this is why I say it's 3 steps, but really 4, because I do consider the notice as a very important step if you do want to obtain tuition reimbursement. Burlington and Carter are actually 2 separate Supreme Court cases that address tuition reimbursement, but took place before the IDEA had an actual specific section addressing unilateral placements within it. So it's still today the standard and the burden that parents must prove before a fact finder. And these are the 3 prongs that you must prove before by preponderance of the evidence. Prong number 1 is FAPE. You gave your notice. The district held an IEP meeting. You gave input. That IEP has been redeveloped. Now the burden is on the parent, the moving party, that the school district has not made a FAPE available to a child in a timely manner prior to enrollment at the private placement. This is where the 10-day notice comes in, the importance of it. And what it's going to come down to is, well, what constitutes a FAPE? The hearing officer is going to look at that IEP, and they're going to determine whether or not it provides the child in question a free and appropriate public education. Some of the things that the hearing officer or administrative law judge may look at is, what about the related services? Is that child receiving physical therapy, speech and language, occupational therapy? Enough of it? How often? Enough to make progress? Is the IEP more of the same? Is it continued goals and continued programming under which a child hasn't made progress over the past several years? Is residential necessary? If so, does this IEP offer that? Does that child need to be in a therapeutic setting? Or is that IEP developed over an evaluation that was improper? Maybe they used they didn't evaluate in all areas of suspected disability, or they used evaluations that aren't commonly accepted. So remember, the big part of this is that the burden is on the parent to prove that that program is inappropriate for their child, not the other way around. Okay. Prong number 2 comes down to the private school. And pardon me for one moment. You gave your 10-day. A new IEP was developed. You reviewed it. You still don't feel it offers your child FAPE. You've now decided to place your child at a private school. Well, prong number 2 at a due process hearing is going to have to be to prove by preponderance of the evidence that the private school that you've chosen is in fact appropriate. Without getting too deep into this, because this isn't we're not trying to get into a deep legal argument and discussion, but it's commonly accepted through case law that even if you chose a private school that you feel is appropriate, it still may be appropriate, even if it doesn't meet state standards that apply to districts or to charter schools. If that school offers specific programming for children with disabilities, but not IEPs, that may not mean it is not appropriate. However, this standard can differ from state to state and from federal circuit to federal circuit. One of the main issues that the court would address is, does this placement confer meaningful benefit and significant learning for that child? If so, it could potentially be an appropriate private school. There is something to consider about the least restrictive environment. The IDEA requires children to be included in regular education classes to the fullest potential. And therefore, the courts will also look at is, did the child jump from a regular education program to a private school program? Could there have been a middle area prior to that jump? Does that render the private school a true full-time placement inappropriate? It's something that could potentially be looked at. We don't see it often, but sometimes we get calls and we get very good questions about certain private schools that clearly are not appropriate. So what aren't appropriate? Well, it's important to discuss this because some people may consider all private schools appropriate based on maybe their size. Their class size is smaller, therefore my child will stay more focused if they have ADHD. The class size or the overall environment is therapeutic in nature. Some schools, especially, I work around Philadelphia where we have a lot of private schools, boys schools, girls schools, co-ed schools that simply don't offer significant special education services. We have boarding schools in the area. And, as you get further into areas of New England, we have very, very good boarding schools, but are they appropriate for a child with a identified disability under the IDEA? That's something to consider. Every once in a while we'll get a call for someone looking for their child to attend a school due to an athletic program. The program at the private school may be better. Is there any way to get the child in through the IDEA? And normally the answer to that is no, because a hearing officer is likely not going to find a private school of that nature to be appropriate to meet the needs of that child to confer meaningful educational benefit. And last is prong 3, which is the equities, which with our clients, we've really never run into a problem with, but were the parents willing to work with the district over the course of time? And this comes up because if the answer to that is no, the parents did not give their 10-day notice, or the parents caused disruption in the IEP process. The parents didn't take a collaborative approach. They refused to consider other private schools, maybe that the district offer. Maybe they didn't go tour them. Maybe they didn't allow for reevaluations to take place that would then allow the district to have created a better program because they denied the evaluation that drives that program. Well, a hearing officer could look at this in the parents' actions, or in some cases inactions, and determine that there should be a reduction in tuition reimbursement due to the parents' actions. And that's what prong 3 of the Burlington Carter test is all about. It's all about the equities and fairness. Okay. What about residential? A lot of our clients have come to us about residential placement, and they say, we're not really certain we can get it. We don't feel it would ever be covered because, frankly, it costs too much. And as much as that may be true, residential placement is still available. We're talking about places under the IDEA and 504. Both the 504 and the IDEA allow for it to be necessary if it's necessary to provide FAPE, and room and board are a part of that as well. It's as long as that, the real question is the room and board for educational purposes, or is it for medical purposes? And that's what we need to address. So what is covered? Education reimbursement, room and board reimbursement. What potentially could not be and likely would not be covered is the clinical or medical care. Just a heads up, I'm on the third floor of my house here, and it's storming pretty good here, pretty significantly. So just a heads up in case I pop in and out. Here in Philadelphia, we're in the federal Third Circuit. So the question when it comes down to residential placements is, if a child's medical, social, or emotional problems are inextricably intertwined with the learning process, then reimbursement for a residential placement is available. And this is really the hard question when it comes down to, because a lot of these cases, districts are able to work with parents and say, of course, your child needs to be in a residential placement, or your child needs to be in a day program. Let's try to work together and see if we can amicably resolve it rather than head to a due process hearing. But if we're not able to do that and a due process hearing takes place, it's going to be the fact finder to determine, okay, where does that line in the sand, where is it drawn between the learning process and clinical and medical supports and programs? This Third Circuit, this inextricably intertwined approach when determining, what should of the tuition reimbursement actually be reimbursed is handled the same way, I believe, in the Fourth and the Fifth Circuits. Although don't quote me on that, because I don't practice in those areas. I'm a Pennsylvania attorney, but this is really the question when it comes down to it. This can be really hard for attorneys because you get a tuition bill that says $100,000 on it. And you might ask that school, you want to ask that school, okay, well, what's the breakdown here? What's the educational, what's the cost for the room and board? And then of course, what's the cost for the clinical? And they'll say, that's all intertwined. You say, oh, okay, well, that's helpful. Thank you very much. And that's just the way it is in some schools. Other schools that I've worked with, I've received an invoice and it comes into 3 brackets. Here's the cost for the education. Here's the cost for the room and board. Here's the cost for the clinical therapeutic issue portions of it. And that's easy to bring to a school district. And a school district can kind of look at that sometimes with a breath of fresh air and say, okay, this is clear. We can do this. But when it's not exactly as easy as that, and it's not exactly clear, it may come down to a fact finder to make that determination. And something to really consider when you're considering schools for your child. How necessary is the residential piece? For some, it's absolute, it's necessary, and you need it, and it's the best for them. And that's what our due process hearings are for, to seek it. It's not written clearly in the IDA like unilateral placement, but there is a way to request the relief of placement at a private school, even though you haven't paid the tuition or your child has not been formally enrolled at that school. And that comes through prospective placement. Actually, when you look back into kind of to the legal history of placement cases under the IDA, Burlington and Carter both dealt with prospective placements because the formal procedure for the IDEA's unilateral placement wasn't written in yet. Because the argument is hearing officers have jurisdiction over identification of a student, determination of the appropriateness of evaluation, or placement of a student can all fall under the jurisdiction of a hearing officer. And I'm sorry, I'm using the word hearing officer, but again, that's the term that we use in the individuals who preside over our due process hearings. The IDEA gives hearing officers, and this is a quote, broad authority to grant such relief as the court determines is appropriate. And that's where Burlington is actually a prospective injunction directive case. District tuition reimbursement for the tuition and direct placement at a private school was what was requested, and it was determined that at least the hearing officers do have jurisdiction to do that. What's the difference? Well, you may not have to put up although it's a legal procedure and it's risky, you may not have to put up the tuition first and then hope to be reimbursed later. Many of these cases happen when we have a student who's identified, and for whatever reason, districts, charter schools may not have an offer of FAPE on the table in appropriate time. Private school may be the only option, and that parent, like many parents, may not be able to front a significant amount of money for tuition reimbursement. And this is where prospective placement needs to comes in. Every federal circuit handles it differently. In the Third Circuit, it is accepted. However, we even see here in Pennsylvania that certain hearing officers won't grant it. They argue that there may not be jurisdiction over, while others will. There hasn't been a true Supreme Court case addressing that, even though Burlington addressed it somewhat. It's been about a half hour of just me talking. And this is some pretty heavy stuff, and it's a heavy issue to address. This is a big decision of whether you want to place your child at a private school. I hope this gave some guidance, but the fact of the matter is that yes, you can, and there is placement. You know, I talked a lot about the IDEA here, but remember, residential placement is still available under 504 if necessary to provide FAPE. And there's also case law out there from the Supreme Court of the United States that even students who haven't been identified, no IEP, no 504 plan, can seek tuition reimbursement if they haven't been offered a free and appropriate public education. That doesn't come up very often. I've never had to deal with that myself as an attorney in the several years that I've been doing this, but there is case law out there to support it. And it is something to consider, because it comes back to that. Well, every child does have a entitled right to a free and appropriate public education, regardless if they have an IEP.